Okay, this video, and I'm going to make another one, I'm going to break this into two parts, is about the civil rights movement. And I'm not exactly sure whether we'll cover one or the other of them in class, but I thought I'd go ahead and make two videos, and then we'll see which one I use. For both of them, I'm using this prop, my bubblegum machine, because you can see here that all of these bubblegum balls are kind of different colors that exist to make kind of a harmonious whole within this bubblegum machine. And this is really the idea of plurality, okay? The idea that instead of a big melting pot ideal like we had during the early part of the 1900s, where all these bubblegum balls would be forced to kind of be melted and made into a single monolithic kind of ugly gray color. Instead, they each can attain their specific cultural identities and instead be appreciated and respected and not really forced to conform to a single American ideal. And certainly the civil rights movement that affects African Americans most directly is key to helping establish that pluralistic ideal. Because we need all races within the country, all races, ethnicities within the country to be respected and given first-class citizenship. And African Americans had not really enjoyed that in their time here in the United States thus far. So the civil rights movement is key to our modern, pluralistic, and multi-ethnic and diverse society. So this early stuff on the, we're going to be learning what the major events in the civil rights movement were and what were the activist goals and what tactics did they use and who led them and were they successful, okay? And these early ones are kind of a review of stuff we've already talked about in the 1950s, but I just want to remind you of it. You see here, this is Linda Brown, and she was the test case that went forward, led by Thurgood Marshall as her NAACP attorney. That was the test case that went forward that helped integrate the public schools. So you know that that's the goal, was to integrate the schools. The NAACP lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, represented Linda Brown, and she sued to attend the nearby white school. The local reaction was that white mobs protested when black students entered schools. In that case, they didn't, because she was already in a middle school that was integrated by the time the court ruling came down. So Linda Brown didn't face white mobs, but later black students did, like the Little Rock Nine that we studied in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay? The federal response is that in all of these cases, and we'll look at university integration later, is that Dwight D. Eisenhower set the precedent that whenever these court rulings came down and integration was attempted and white mobs tried to prevent that federal troops would be sent to protect the students and usher them into the school and protect them while they were there. So none of that there should be of surprise to you because we have talked about it before. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about at length is the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It happened in the 50s, but we haven't spoken about it because it's so integral to the civil rights movement that was mainly in the 60s that I have delayed talking about it in class. The goal of the Montgomery Bus Boycott was to integrate public transportation. I should talk a little bit about how buses worked back then so that you'll have an understanding of kind of what the situation was. So back then, if you rode a bus, if you were black, you were expected to go to the front of the bus, go up the steps to the driver, put your money in, and then you were expected to exit the bus and go to the back door of the bus and actually get on the bus. There was a small number of seats in the back that were set aside for black people, and they could only sit in those assigned seats. Now, if if the bus became full and a white person didn't have a seat, they could go to the black area and ask the black patrons to please give their seat to them. And it wasn't just that one seat that one person had to get up. If a white person sat on any part of that row on either side of the aisle, then all of those people had to get up. It was now deemed a white a white row in the bus. And so a single white person could displace as many as 4 African American people who were sitting down. So it was quite a power play that went on a daily basis on American buses in the South. Okay? Well, it is Rosa Parks that decides that she's an NAACP secretary, so she's not someone who just kind of comes out of nowhere to lead this movement. But one day she decides to refuse to give her seat to a white man. And a young minister who is new in town, Martin Luther King, and he has a lovely young wife, Coretta Scott King, and he steps forward to help lead a boycott of the buses, where they asked no black people to ride the buses in Montgomery. Montgomery is, of course, in Alabama. And everybody's quite stunned because black people really depended upon the buses for their transportation in Montgomery, and nobody thought that there would be 100% participation, but there literally was. The boycott goes on for 381 days. They eventually win it. They economically put so much pressure on the bus companies that they really cannot remain in business without changing their policy and bringing black ridership back to the buses. The local reaction to this is that Martin Luther King's home is bombed, and they actually sued, the company sued Martin Luther King's organization and asked them to stop the boycott, to actually give a speech telling them that the boycott had been called off. But the courts ruled in Martin Luther King's favor, and so the boycott was upheld and eventually did work in terms of exerting enough economic pressure on the bus companies to change. Okay? And here's a picture of Rosa Parks getting processed and Martin Luther King riding on the integrated buses on that first day. Do not assume that the white people around him are upset about this. These are probably all people around him who were working for the movement. And there were sympathetic white people in Montgomery who helped with the movement and lent their cars and assistance to the effort, as well as many black people of all different social classes as well. Then we have the sit-ins. The goal of sit-ins were to integrate eating establishments where black people had been banned. If you remember, black people were only allowed to get their food at the back window and then eat outside. So now they want black people to be able to go inside restaurants and eat and get service. And a lot of like drugstores back then had a lunch counter. And it was at the Woolworths in Greensboro that the first, not the first, there were sit-ins actually throughout World War II, but the most famous sit-ins took place. It was in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. There were 4 North Carolina A&T students, all males, 1 a Korean War veteran. And they sat down at the whites-only counter and were peaceful and quiet, but were hoping to be served. The local reaction was that they were beaten up and they were arrested and suspended from school for breaking segregation laws. There is no federal response to these kinds of things, though there are many sit-ins after this. Sit-ins really start to sweep the nation. A large group of students in Memphis take up this cause as well. And they begin sitting in not only for service at lunch counters, but also to get fair hiring practices in those drugstores to make sure that people were being hired who were black. So there's no federal response because these kind of pop up like popcorn, and by the time they're usually handled by local police, and there's no sustained long-term need for federal troops. But they certainly do cause a lot of stress and excitement in the communities where they pop up. Here's an example of a sit-in on the left, and these are the 4 men and their names that participated in the first sit-ins in Greensboro. The Woolworth counter in Greensboro had been preserved to some degree, and now has been opened up as a civil rights museum in the last few years. And you can go see it in Greensboro. I've heard it's great. They took one section of the lunch counter and sent it to the Smithsonian Museum, but the rest of it remained there. All right, the next part of the civil rights movement was called the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides was about buses that traveled between states. So let me explain this a little bit before we look at the video. Okay, so the federal government had long ago ruled that buses that travel between states, because the federal government can regulate interstate trade, that they could not segregate in their waiting rooms or on their buses. And the Southerners who ran those bus companies had just basically ignored this. They had not been enforcing that law at all. So all that the black civil rights movement protesters wanted to bring attention to is that the existing law was not being enforced, and it needed to be enforced. They weren't trying to bring about a new law. They were just trying to get the law as it existed enforced. So their goal, they are mainly college students, their goal is to integrate the buses that travel between states. Okay? And make sure there's no segregated waiting rooms, and make sure that there's no segregation on the buses themselves. The people who participated in this movement were mainly college students, both black and white, who were mainly going to college in the North, as you can imagine. And they decided to spend their summers doing this, and then eventually a lot of them dropped out of school, actually, to participate in riding these buses all throughout the South to show how the federal law was not being upheld. Local reaction, it gets very dicey, and the further south they go, as you can imagine, the more frightening it becomes. The mobs attack the buses, and there are beatings of the people on the buses and firebombings. Not exactly a welcome wagon that meets them in most deep South towns. Finally, the violence gets so bad, and the bus drivers were refusing to drive the buses. They were also having a problem with just all of interstate transportation being interrupted. that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, he ordered 400 marshals to protect them and help shepherd them safely in the later part of their trek. The first freedom riders that left Washington, D.C. into the South, a lot of them actually abandoned the cause, and it was students from Memphis who then took up the rest of the freedom rides and finished them. This is a map that shows you some of the routes that they used to demonstrate how the law was not being upheld. And here's a picture of one of the firebombed buses. It's a Greyhound bus, as you can see. All right, all of this leads to some very famous and infamous, I guess you would say, demonstrations that happened in Birmingham. It was in Birmingham, Alabama, that there were attempts upon African Americans in that city to desegregate the whole city. They were being very ambitious. They wanted to integrate the lunch counters, they wanted to integrate the buses, and they wanted to ensure more fairness in downtown hiring at downtown stores as well. And so they began a whole process of marches and refusing to shop at the stores. It was in the Easter season, actually, refusing to shop at those stores. Martin Luther King comes and begins to help lead the Birmingham demonstrations. He is, they cannot get a permit to march in most of these cases, so they march, and since those marches are deemed illegal, he is arrested. And he, from jail, writes a letter from a Birmingham jail in which it's a very famous response to some local preachers, white preachers, who were criticizing their actions and saying that maybe there would be a better time, that this wasn't a great time to try and be leading these demonstrations. And to their credit, Birmingham actually was having a struggle for their local government who was going to control it. They had tried to move from one form of government, like a council system, to a commissioner system, I think. And both sides were claiming that they were the legitimate government of Birmingham. So during these demonstrations, there were actually two governments claiming that they actually ran Birmingham, which meant no one really ran Birmingham. And so there was kind of a power vacuum that went on at the same time that all of this was going on. The most innovative thing they did is they had a children's march where they gathered up children and let them miss school to participate in these marches because they knew that jailed children would put a lot more stress on the law enforcement and jail community than adults, and that also children don't have a lot of the responsibilities for going to work or paying mortgages and bills that adults did. So that was a very innovative aspect of the demonstrations. There were arrests in jail. The police chief, his name was Eugene Connor, but he was known as Bull Connor. He, in this power vacuum that had gone on at the local government level, he kind of was able to do whatever he wanted. And he deemed that fire hoses and dogs would be appropriate ways to stop the demonstrations. And then that led to huge media coverage of that response that got on the evening news internationally and brought great attention to this cause. So in a way, Bull Connor was the civil rights movement's worst nightmare, but he was also their greatest friend because they got them the international media coverage that they had been seeking to gain attention to their cause. It's after this that President Kennedy asks for calm, and he promises to get a federal civil rights law passed to try and bring an end to the need for these kinds of demonstrations. And he had been really a reluctant supporter of civil rights. He'd not been a supporter at all, actually. Most civil rights activists were very disappointed with John Kennedy's response. So, but the Birmingham marches really kind of pushed this to the limits and showed that something had to be done on the federal level. Okay? So, that is Civil Rights Movement Part 1. And we'll move on to Part 2. Let's see what flavor of gumball I get. Pink. Who doesn't love pink? Well, I guess boys. Okay, sorry. See you in class.